So, these days, everyone's excited about something new. They're excited about new technology, new approach, a new process. But today, you're going to leave this room with some old ways of thinking. I'm Libby. I'm a producer here at Portable. The ideas that I'm sharing with you today are ones that I've been researching because I'm curious. I've been researching Eastern and Western philosophical ideas to apply to project management. And I'll preface this talk with, I am not an academic. But why would I even decide to look at these particular ideas to relate to my modern working life? Well, for those of us who work in account management, in project management, as producers or studio managers, working life is pretty fast-paced. It requires us to juggle so many tasks at one time. We have to keep our clients happy. You have to keep your team busy. We've got to remember whose coffee I left my, where did I leave my coffee this morning? Whose desk did I leave it on? So look, people think this is what I do, but actually, this is what I do a lot of the time. So, my own experience of these roles led me to think every day, like, how can I love this job so much and yet have an existential crisis about it every day? And so, what to do? Surely, someone has felt this way before. And it turns out that they have. For a long time, for all of human history. And so I turned to philosophy. And so you might have heard of this guy. Plato was born in 427 BCE in Greece, and he was a student of the famous philosopher Socrates. He's known for his thinking around fulfillment, and you might even be familiar with this saying, know thyself. So Plato taught it's important to question your ideas rather than act on impulse. He believed that by knowing yourself, you are less likely to be affected by your emotions. So how does this relate to project management? Well, apart from every day being an emotional roller coaster, from my perspective, it's really good to know what you're good at as the leader of a team, but it's even more important to know what you suck at. So I was once managing a team and we were responsible for the QA outputs of that team. They were struggling a bit. They weren't quite hitting the marks that we needed to be. And so I really love designing processes. And I thought, you know what? Like what we need is we kind of need another layer here that's going to catch any mistakes before they go out of the studio. And so I sat down, thought about it. I discussed it with the team. Once we'd come up with a solution, we went through it, we were all happy, and we rolled it out. But months and months kind of went by, and I still had one team member who just couldn't keep up and who kept failing all their QA measures. And so I grew more and more frustrated, basically. I couldn't understand why this particular team member couldn't keep up with the rest of the team and complete this particular process that we'd all instilled and we'd all agreed on. But it occurred to me that that particular team member was actually really demotivated by doing things the same time. And they only wanted to do things differently each time. That's what motivated them. That's what they really enjoyed doing. And so another process, just wasn't going to suit this particular employee's needs. And so I realised my own love of process was a huge blind spot in how I was tackling this particular problem with the studio. And so once I realised this, it was kind of groundbreaking. And subsequently, I've really altered how I approach creating these particular processes and different ways of implementing these sorts of things. So, in particular, identifying a team member's strength and find a workaround that actually engages them rather than demotivates them is the most important thing here. So I'm now aware that my love of process can be a strength, but also has a dark side too. So how do you identify your own blind spots? Who's heard of Johari's window before? Has anyone heard of it? A couple of hands. So it looks a bit like this. And so it's a psychology tool that is all about improving your own self-awareness. So if you're going to know thyself, using Johari's window is a really great tool to start with. The reason why is to work towards your understanding of your own leadership blind spots. Once you know these, you can change your own behaviours and your working style to work better with others. And once you know your weaknesses, you can build a team that has strengths where you don't. Because you actually can't be good at everything, and so why not build a team that's good at what you suck at? So now looking to the east, did you know Confucius was a scrum master? One of Confucius's teachings was all about the importance of ceremony. He was all about ritual propriety, because ceremonies are like a common language, basically. They are a forum in which people know how to behave, they know how to communicate, because the rules are kind of set up for these very particular ways in which we follow a ceremony. So it's important for leaders of teams to keep lines of communication open if you're actually going to be able to triage the right problems. Like lots of businesses working in digital, Portable does at the end or even during a project what we call a retrospective. So a team will sit down individually on some post-it notes, write out for 5 minutes things that they liked about the project, things that they didn't like, and then maybe some things that they learnt as well. Pretty much what this has done is it enables us to have clear rules of the room, and we're able to identify the stuff that went really well and the stuff that went really bad. So as a project manager, I found this format really incredible, because after completing it regularly, I could start to see patterns in the sorts of things that were floating to the top of a retro all the time. For like a really simple example as this is, I was running a development project and we kept being really squeezed for time during our quality assurance testing. And we were not being able to complete the tickets that we needed to within the sprint. And so after receiving that feedback at Retro a couple of times, we decided to reassess how many tickets were part of a sprint. We were able to add another day's QA to buffer out our timelines so that we were able to complete the work that we had bitten off in time. So what that has meant is those sorts of really simple things that you can triage in a really nimble fashion come to the fore when you have a ceremony, and a really regular ceremony at that you're able to do that. The ceremony is your direct line to hear the grievances of your team. But how you respond to these grievances is really key. A more complicated example could be that if you have a number of problems that are reoccurring, and if you're doing ceremonies on a really regular basis, these sorts of things, like I said, start to show patterns, and some sorts of problems could show up that are more deeply seated. You could have a team member that is, the results from a retro might be showing that you might have a team member who might not be pulling their weight, and there can often be larger risks by not addressing these sorts of more serious issues earlier. So we have to be willing to learn. We have to be humbled, and we have to truly listen about the stuff that has or is going wrong. Encouragement of these rituals are an important and central part of understanding and communicating. They're a forum to check in on the health of your project and your team, and they bring about a shared understanding. So, humans love things that are familiar, and by bringing more rituals into your project management can bring about more shared understanding with yourself and your team. Now, you've probably heard of someone being described as Stoic. It's often referred to as someone being brave or being resilient, but Stoicism is actually a movement in philosophy all about how to do life, basically. There are two main philosophers I'd like to draw from who were part of this movement. The first one was Marcus Aurelius, who was the leader of ancient Rome at one point in time. And the other is Seneca. Now, Seneca knew about how to deal with a difficult client because he was the tutor to Emperor Nero. And if you don't know who Emperor Nero is, he was a pretty awful dictator back in ancient Rome, and he did some really messed up stuff, including ordering Seneca to death in front of his whole family. It's pretty morbid. And Seneca's last words were apparently, "What need is there to weep over parts of life? The whole of it calls for tears." Philosophy. Oh man. But anyway, it actually gets better. So Stoicism is all about dealing with anxiety. They said the only way to deal with anxiety is to acknowledge that yes, something bad actually might happen. You might blow that budget, you might lose that client, but at the end of the day, you will be okay. And that's why I love Stoicism, because you will be okay, and there is actually something that you can do about it. So the Stoics suggest to regularly rehearse worst-case scenarios in your mind. Set your expectations for the worst, and you'll be able to withstand anything, even failure. And as Marcus Aurelius said, we are each of us stronger than we think. So here's me. This is my face when I've got 150 emails to read. I've got 201 Slack notifications to catch up on. Oh dear. And I've just got a giant to-do list that just never seems to end. And so I don't know about the other project managers or producers or account managers or studio managers in the room, but man, my own challenges have often come down to my own feelings of being just overwhelmed by how much there is to do. Sometimes I say that being a producer is like carrying a large balloon of water everywhere. And if you try and imagine carrying a really large balloon of water and you just try and get a firmer grip on just want to hold it a bit tighter, it's just going to do this, or it's going to spill over, or it's really hard to get a really firm grip on anything because things just move so fast. And so Baruch Spinoza was born in 1632 in Amsterdam. His teachings revolved around looking at our suffering. He came up with the concept of under the aspect of eternity, which is basically about looking at all your problems as if you were looking at them from space. He argues that in doing this, the problems that we might be facing are actually quite insignificant. So, by viewing these problems from another perspective, Spinoza said we participate in what is called eternal totality, which to me sounds a bit like the end of the world, which is what I felt when a project hasn't been going to plan. But I like to call it a moon moment. So what this teaches us is that to be resilient, we need to create some space between ourselves and the challenge that we're facing. Who of the project managers here feels like you tackle so many things in a day that you're pretty much on a train with no time to even think about the next destination? I found that the more space, there's a few people, I found that the more space in my day for reflection, the more resilient I can be. So I think it's really important that people finish work on time. We already work 40-hour weeks, and I think it's really important to do things like take that time out to exercise or read a book. And I'm really pleased to hear so many industry leaders who are really encouraging people to look after their mental health when it comes to work. And Jeremy Wartsman from the Jackie Winter Group says that for those of us who work in creative problem-solving roles, that going to a psychologist to look after your brain is just the same as a physio looking after an athlete's body. So I need time to reflect, and I need time to reflect after my meetings. I need to distill down the really important information so that I can actually be strategic and action the right things. I need time for reflection before I make a large decision. And really, if we're going to visit the moon, we need time to get there and back. So be protective of your time. When you do this, you'll return feeling refreshed, resilient, and able to see things much more clearly. So, who agrees with me that a project manager, or another term for a project manager, could be professional communicator? Because I think I spend all my days communicating. That's such a huge part of the job. And so when it comes to communication, Aristotle was obsessed. So he spent a lot of time watching public debates in ancient Greece, and he couldn't believe how many talented people would just get up in front of these audiences and fail to convince them of the ideas that they were trying to present. There are a number of philosophers who contributed to the art of what is called rhetoric, which is basically getting someone to agree with you. And these include Socrates and Plato, but Aristotle was a key driver in advancing this particular school of thought. And we as producers spend all our time trying to get people to agree with us. And there are two main instances that I can think of where this happens in our role. The first is that I need to back my design team up on the design decisions we've made, and I need to explain them to the client. I also need to rationalise why effort is better spent on building a new functionality to the client. I have to back my team up on all those decisions and then explain them to a client who in some instances has never even been engaged with a developer or a designer before, and they're super unfamiliar with the process. So there's a lot at play there. The second is that once I've communicated things to my client, I then need to communicate those things back to my team. So I have to provide context, why we have to do another round of changes on something. I need to explain why we need to find a quick hack rather than being able to enhance or build something bigger for a website. And there's just never enough time, so I have to explain to my team about what to prioritise and what things to time box. There are 3 points I'd like to draw from Aristotle's work in this particular area. The first is calm people's fears. Fears can completely undo a project. Like, who knows of a project that they've had where they just know that one person at the other end was scared to make that leap and go for a more edgy solution? If one of your clients is scared about taking that risk, it could be because they might lose funding if we don't get this project right. We can't move forward if we don't understand what motivates people. It's important to have empathy from the start and work hard to calm anyone who you feel is unsettled. The second is we need to understand people's emotions. So when it comes to understanding fears, we also need to know what emotions might be at play there. You might have an anxious designer who's not sure that they can deliver what you need. You might also have a client who's embarrassed because they don't think that they can get that budget to be able to build the last round of designs. We need to know what emotions are at play. We need to know what emotions might be influencing their decisions in order to get our own ideas across. And the last part is that Aristotle says to make it funny, because even people in ancient Greece had short attention spans. So lots of people have different project management styles, but I have to say that I've personally found having a shared Slack channel with my project team and with my client has been a really great way to break down that really rigid client and supplier relationship. Pretty much because it's a really accessible way to share emojis or GIFs whenever you want. And look, if that's not really something that everyone is able to do, I just highly recommend picking up the phone and talking to your clients more often, because there's something really human about actually talking to someone on the line and not just sending an email. So that way you can better gauge emotion, you can better gauge the tone of their voice, and you can actually hear them laugh at the other end of the line. So, in all seriousness, emotion and empathy is at the core of understanding. If you can't be empathetic to a client or your team members' fears and their emotions, you'll fail to convince them of your ideas. Now, we know that there were not only men in ancient Greece, but funnily enough, women did exist too. Who knew? So on the topic of rhetoric, Socrates was instructed and really deeply influenced by a woman named Aspasia. And Aspasia was born in what is now modern-day Turkey, and she migrated to Athens in around 445 BCE. And she was actually educated at that point. She'd been schooled by her father. And she's accredited with establishing an academic centre for the exchange of ideas, which was for young women in Athens. Unfortunately, though, Aspasia's original works on rhetoric haven't actually survived. But it is evident from other published works from this era that her influence was very far-reaching. As we don't have access to Aspasia's work, I wanted to study other female interpretations of rhetoric and communication. And I particularly aligned with the teachings about the importance of communicating with emotion from modern psychologist and philosopher Carol Gilligan. So Carol says, I found that if I say what I'm thinking and feeling, people are more likely to say and think what they feel. Now, why is this important? Not everyone's great at empathy, and I'm pretty certain that no one is good at reading minds. So only you can control how you communicate. If you're trying to convey a difficult message, emoting is actually the hinge on which communication relies because it creates empathy. Now, it's not about getting emotional, but it's about delivering how you felt in a really earnest and really thoughtful way. If we're able to create that safe space by doing that, in turn, those people may in fact share more openly with you. So, say, for example, you are leading a project and it's a new client for you, but you've actually taken over that project from another account manager in the business. That client is just in a bit of a bad habit. They keep ringing that old account manager for the project that you've been assigned. So as this goes on, the account manager who used to manage the job picks up the phone. They go ahead, they find out what the inquiry was, they go and solve that inquiry for the client, and then they don't bring you into that process. So that's pretty frustrating. Like, over time, you can feel pretty frustrated that every time that account manager picks up the phone, they're not actually directing them to you when you should be taking this project off their plate. So as you feel more and more frustrated, it's hindering you from being able to do your job, basically. And so here is where communicating is what you really need to communicate is emotion in this point in time. And to demonstrate how, it's a bit obscure, but I've used some techniques from interpersonal effectiveness module in dialectical behaviour therapy, which sounds very, very fancy, but all it really is just how to be a better communicator. So what you need to do is you need to sit that other account manager down in private. In factual terms, you need to describe to them what has happened. So you say, hey, thanks heaps for handing over this project. Look, I've just noticed the client has just been ringing you for a number of things. And look, instead of looping me in on that process or taking down their inquiry and letting the client know that I'll call them back, that you've just been going ahead and answering those inquiries. The client, which in turn has just basically meant the client hasn't even needed to call me. So you've defined what's happened. Like, there's not a lot other than just from start to finish what's been going on. Then you need to emote. Follow up by saying, I understand that this might not be your intention, but by consistently going and solving the problems for that client, it's almost as if you're communicating to that client that you don't trust me to do that job for you. And that has made me feel really upset. It's made me feel untrustworthy. And that's the key, and that's the point in which the other account manager has empathy for you in that particular position, and they realise how their actions have affected you negatively. The key is to emote, but not be emotional. In every instance where I've used this particular method, the person at the other end has only ever been apologetic and empathetic for what has happened. An important last piece to finish up is by asserting what you'd like to happen next. So you might say, hey, look, if the client calls in future, would you mind just jotting down their inquiry, let them know I'll get back to them. And that pretty much means that I can take on the job. It shows the client that you trust me to do the job, and then I get to take that thing off your very busy plate. So as leaders of teams, we can communicate better by being empathetic or by using emotion to help others empathise with us. So, how good's this guy? Like, I really like that his eyebrows are also in his beard as well. So this is Lao Tzu, and he was a Chinese philosopher from the 6th century BCE. His teachings form some of the basis of Taoism, and most of all, he loved to give an analogy using nature to demonstrate his point. In this case, I want to talk a bit more about being more like bamboo. So at its core, Lao Tzu's teachings are actually the perfect antidote to the overstimulated world. What I've learnt about being a project manager is that even the best laid plans don't work. Lao Tzu says, "Become as bamboo already is. Hold fast to the mountain, take root in a broken up bluff, grow stronger after tribulations, and withstand wind from all directions." So now when things aren't going right, just imagine yourself as a skinny little bendy piece of wood. It's pretty peaceful. So speaking of resilience, Immanuel Kant was someone who also liked to give analogies using trees. He was a German philosopher, and this one quote sums up what it means to be really flexible. To not be a perfectionist when it comes to being a project manager. And get ready, because I don't know about you, but like this one blew my mind. Out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made. Like, we're all human, and there's actually no way to run a perfect project. Oh. As like someone who loves routine and, you know, is pretty organised about things, it's pretty overwhelming. So I've reflected a lot on this. I've reflected about being more flexible like bamboo, and it's important to practice acceptance. And this is really important to being a project manager. The reason why is because you can't control everything, but you can only respond to the changes and challenges that you face. That's the only thing that you can actually control. So lots of the time, the situation is just out of your control. For example, when I ran my first website development project, I was completely absorbed in trying to make this project run smoothly. Like, it was my first one, I was really nervous. And so every time that something didn't go to plan, every time that, you know, we missed a ticket or we didn't quite pick something up, you know, I felt a personal responsibility and disappointment that I hadn't seen it coming. Now, that might seem a bit unfair, but often in this role, it can kind of feel like the weight of the world is actually on your shoulders. So remember the Stoics? Like, maybe if I'd set my expectations a bit differently, I wouldn't ended up just burning out over that entire project. And so I'm not saying that you should be completely complacent to things just going wrong all the time, that it's completely out of your hands, but setting your own expectations and choosing your battles is the most important part about staying in the game. Now, for my last discussion today, one of Western philosophy's greatest thinkers. She is a leader. She is a feminist. She's a philosopher. She is a model project manager. She is Leslie Knope. Now, for those who aren't familiar with Leslie, she's a fictional character from a TV show called Parks and Recreation. Oh yeah. Now, I've already mentioned that there's a huge lack of representation of women in ancient philosophies. But being a modern woman, I have also looked at stories of those who reflect my own. This is most easily accessed through things like pop culture. And despite not being a real person per se or a philosopher, her character is endearing, overwhelmingly passionate about her work, incredibly organised, and she cares about her co-workers and the people in her town so much, it's both lovable and annoying. So I relate to Leslie because much of her character reflects about how I feel about being a producer. The role is at sometimes frustrating. Can be pretty thankless sometimes because you're the backstage manager and you're not the star on the stage. Sometimes there are times when projects have so many roadblocks. You spend all your time running around trying to find a solution in the most positive way, which Leslie does all the time, even to the point where she won't admit that things are going so wrong. But she only does that out of a love for her team and for the people who live in her town. But sometimes it's hard to have perspective on work-life balance when the role is so all-consuming. Leslie says, what we have to remember what's important in life, is friends, waffles, and work. Or waffles, friends, and work, but work has to come third. So, at the end of the day, it's a job. Work hard like Leslie. Love your work like Leslie. Jam on your planner like Leslie. But get your priorities right. So, after spending some time in the past and watching hours and hours of Parks and Recreation, there's 8 seasons, there's a lot. Here is my philosophical cheat sheet to applying old ideas to new ways of working. Acknowledge what you suck at and find out your leadership blind spots. Introduce rituals to your projects for making communication accessible. Imagine the worst, but do your best, because you'll be okay. Use empathy to discover motivations and use emotion to let others empathise with you. Be a flexible little piece of bamboo to withstand changes and challenges at any time. Go to the moon when you feel overwhelmed and get your priorities right. I really love my job. I honestly do, and I love that I get to be a conduit of so much information all the time. I get to have FaceTime with some incredible designers and developers and get an insight into how they make something out of nothing. I love that I get to talk to different organisations and hear about the distinct challenges that they are trying to solve. And most of all, I love being the person who straddles the gap between client, designer, and developer. So, what engaging in old ways of thinking has taught me is that there are fundamental human challenges that we face every day. Sometimes I just ask myself, why is it so hard? Like, why? Why is it so hard? But actively applying philosophy is a wonderful support mechanism to make you feel more stoic, more resilient, and accept the imperfect. Create some calm in this chaotic world. That's it. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. I've just got a couple of thanks. Thanks to Portable for giving me the opportunity to share and hosting and putting on nibbles and drinks and things. Thanks to Peter Roper, who spent lots of time letting me word vomit all my interests at him, and we came up with the concept of this talk, and also for writing the killer body copy that you did for the invites. Thanks to Annabelle McGugan, for being my own stage manager and running this event and making all the pieces come together, because you're amazing. Thank you to Ashley for the lovely intro today, and thanks to all the Portable crew for your constructive feedback and sitting through this prezo with me a number of times to help me get it right. And thank you to all of you for coming today. It's such a weird topic, but I'm so glad that we had some people turn up. So that's it.
Okay, Okay, guys, we'll throw to the floor with some questions. Does anyone have anything to start? Do stick your hand and point to you and stand up. Hi.
Hi, my name's Rory. Just a hot bit. Did you come across any Machiavellianism in your research? And what did you think of that in terms of project management?
I did not, but I'll have to throw it to what did you think about Machiavellism?
I would say that he is often misunderstood.
I'm afraid I didn't come across him in my particular areas of research.
In that, if you do find him worth reading, I would say don't think of it as a guide on how to live your life, but more of a description of how people do live their lives to understand it.
I'll look him up. Thank you. Thanks. Is anyone else hot? I'm really hot. One over here.
Hello, I'm Sarah. Libby, I would never asked you, despite like a long time of working together, at what point did you decide I am going to be project manager?
Oh, do you know what?
What was the question?
So the question was, at what point did I decide I was going to become a project manager? There are two parts to this. One is when I was 7, and all I wanted to be was a receptionist. I just thought that was the coolest job. You get to answer the phones, you get to like put things in the mail. Anyway, so that was probably number 1 when I thought I wanted to be a project manager. But the second, I think, was so I studied graphic design, and I worked as a designer for many years, and there isn't really a course to do studio management. And so I think when I started at my first design studio, there was a studio manager there, and they were organising all of the designers, and I thought, oh, that looks like fun, which isn't what lots of people think about when they're a designer and then wanting to just organise everybody else. But I think that was the second time, was when I met a studio manager. I was like, oh, that's a job? You can be like a project manager for designers? And I was like, okay, cool. Others? Yes.
Libby, what sparked your interest in all of this?
My existential crisis that I was having every day, pretty much. So I think that, as I've kind of spoken about tonight, the job's hard. Like, it's overwhelming. Some days you just are like so much to keep on top of, so many moving pieces. And I think that I was introduced to philosophy through Elaine de Botton, who runs the School of Life, and I think I came across some fairly accessible kind of texts around philosophy that have been written more recently, and that's how that kind of sparked that interest, and I realised, oh, there's actually heaps in here that can help me cope on a day-to-day basis. Alrighty, I'll be milling around afterwards. You're welcome to stay for a drink and finish off all the nibbles. Come ask me any questions if you have any. Thanks.